In ancient Egypt, where power flows through bloodlines and tradition rules with iron authority, General Khaemwaset stands as the kingdom's greatest warrior. His victories against Nubian raiders and Libyan tribes have made him a legend throughout the Nile Valley. Palace nobles compete for his favor, offering their daughters in marriage to secure alliance with the empire's most feared commander. But when Khaemwaset returns from his latest campaign, he shocks the royal court with an unprecedented declaration. Instead of choosing a princess or noble daughter, he claims Naia, a humble slave girl from the palace kitchens, as his bride. The announcement sends tremors through Egypt's rigid social order. Whispers fill the corridors of power as courtiers struggle to understand how a man who could have any woman in the kingdom would choose someone so far beneath his station. What drove Egypt's mightiest warrior to make such a scandalous choice that would shake the very foundations of the empire? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust clouds rose like golden smoke against the azure sky as General Khaemwaset's war chariot thundered through the gates of Thebes. His bronze ceremonial Kaupro sword, awarded for his first major victory against the Hittites, caught the afternoon sunlight as it hung at his side. The curved blade had tasted the blood of Egypt's enemies across 3 kingdoms, earning him the title the Lion of the South. Behind him rolled a procession that spoke of triumph. Captured Libyan chariots loaded with gold and precious stones, columns of prisoners destined for the slave markets, and most impressive of all, the war banners of defeated chieftains, now flying beneath Egypt's sacred falcon standard. The crowds lining the sacred way pressed forward, desperate to catch a glimpse of the man who had extended Egypt's influence deep into hostile territory. Khaemwaset himself was a sight that commanded attention even without the trappings of victory. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, his frame bore the scars of countless battles, a jagged line across his left shoulder from a Nubian spear, burn marks on his forearms from defending a siege tower, the proud battle marks of a warrior who led from the front. His dark eyes surveyed the celebrating crowds with the measured gaze of a man accustomed to reading terrain for advantages and threats. The palace of Pharaoh Amenhotep III rose before them like a vision from the gods themselves. Limestone walls gleamed white as morning clouds, while golden accents caught and threw back the sun's rays in dazzling displays. Painted columns depicted the pharaoh's divine ancestry stretching back to the sun god Ra himself, and gardens filled with exotic plants from across the known world demonstrated Egypt's reach and prosperity. In the Great Hall, Pharaoh Amenhotep received his victorious general with the ceremony, due a man who had added 3 cities and countless gold talents to the royal treasury. The aging ruler, now in his 60th year, had grown heavy with the comforts of absolute power, but his mind remained sharp as obsidian. "My lion returns with fresh glory," the pharaoh declared, his voice carrying across the assembled court. "The gods smile upon Egypt through your victories, Khaemwaset. I serve at your command, Divine One. The enemies of Maat have been scattered like chaff before the wind." As the formal ceremonies proceeded, Khaemwaset's attention was caught by movement in the shadows beyond the Great Hall. Through an archway that led to the palace's working quarters, he glimpsed figures, moving with purposeful efficiency, servants preparing for the victory feast that would follow. Most were the usual palace staff, but one figure moved with a grace that seemed different from the others. A young woman emerged briefly into the light carrying a large water vessel. Her skin bore the golden tone of Upper Egypt, and though she wore the simple white shift of a kitchen slave, there was something in her bearing that caught his warrior's eye. She moved not with the hurried desperation of most slaves, but with quiet dignity, as if she carried herself according to some inner standard, rather than external compulsion. Their eyes met across the vast space of the hall for just a moment. Hers were the color of deep water, intelligent and alert, holding depth that seemed impossible in one so young and supposedly humble. Then she was gone, disappeared back into the working quarters, as if she had never been there at all. The feast that evening was magnificent even by royal standards. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted ox and gazelle, fresh fish from the Nile, honeyed fruits from the palace orchards, and wine from vineyards that stretched along the river's fertile banks. Musicians played while dancers moved with hypnotic grace, and the air was sweet with incense burned in honor of the gods who had granted victory. Yet through all the celebration, Khaemwaset found his thoughts returning to that brief glimpse of the water-bearer. There had been something in her eyes, not fear which he was accustomed to seeing in slaves, but a kind of quiet strength. Most servants looked away quickly when they encountered nobility, trained from birth to avoid drawing attention that might prove dangerous. But she had met his gaze directly, if only for a moment, and in that meeting he had sensed a spirit that had not been broken by bondage. It was curious, and Khaemwaset was a man who had learned to pay attention to things that struck him as unusual. On the battlefield, such observations often meant the difference between victory and defeat. As the evening wore on and the wine flowed freely, nobles approached with the usual requests and compliments. Several mentioned daughters or nieces who would be honored to catch the great general's attention. Princess Ankhesenamun herself, a woman of considerable beauty and royal lineage, made subtle inquiries about his future plans. But Khaemwaset's mind kept drifting to shadowed archways and intelligent dark eyes that had looked upon him without fear. Naia's hands moved with practiced efficiency as she filled the clay water vessel from the palace well. The simple pottery jug had been her constant companion for 3 years now, its worn surface smooth from countless trips to fetch water for the kitchen preparations. Each morning before dawn, she would make this journey, carrying water that would cook the food and clean the vessels that served Egypt's most powerful nobles. She had been barely 14 when the Nubian raiders swept through her village like locusts, taking everything of value including the children strong enough to work. The memory of that day remained sharp as broken glass. The screams of her mother, the flames consuming their modest home, the rough hemp rope that bound her wrists as she was dragged away from everything she had ever known. The slave market in Memphis had been a nightmare of humanity, reduced to merchandise. Men examined her teeth like those of a horse, felt her muscles to gauge her capacity for work, discussed her potential value as if she possessed no more consciousness than a piece of furniture. When the palace buyer selected her for kitchen work, she had felt relief that she would not face the darker fates that awaited prettier girls in wealthier households. The palace kitchens operated under the iron rule of Merit, a woman whose cruelty seemed to increase with each year of her authority. Merit had been born a slave but earned her position through absolute loyalty to the established order, and she ruled the kitchen staff with punishments that left lasting scars both visible and hidden. Most slaves learned quickly to keep their heads down, speak only when spoken to, and never display any spark of individual thought that might draw unwanted attention. But Naia possessed a quality that proved impossible to completely suppress, an intelligent curiosity about the world around her. When nobles discarded papyrus scrolls that contained writing, she would secretly study the hieroglyphs, slowly teaching herself to read the sacred symbols that were supposedly beyond a slave's understanding. She learned that the world extended far beyond Egypt's borders, that there were lands where different gods were worshipped and different customs observed. Her ability to read set her apart from other slaves in ways that could prove dangerous. Knowledge was power in Egypt, and slaves were not meant to possess power of any kind. So she kept her literacy secret, pretending ignorance when documents passed through the kitchens, never revealing that she understood the contents of the messages that sometimes accompanied visiting dignitaries. The work itself was demanding but not cruel. She prepared vegetables for elaborate feasts, cleaned cooking vessels until they gleamed, and helped serve the endless meals required to feed the palace's vast population of nobles, priests, and servants. Her hands grew strong from kneading bread dough and skilled at the delicate work of preparing spices and seasonings. But it was during the water-fetching duties that Naia found her moments of peace. The journey to the well took her through sections of the palace she would never otherwise see, corridors lined with painted walls depicting the gods and their divine stories, courtyards where exotic plants grew in carefully tended gardens, chambers where the business of governing Egypt's vast territories was conducted. She had developed a practice of walking these routes slowly when possible, observing everything around her with the intensity of someone storing memories against an uncertain future. The hieroglyphs on the walls told stories of pharaohs who had ruled centuries before, of battles fought and won, of the eternal cycle of death and rebirth that governed all life along the Nile. Sometimes she encountered palace nobles during these journeys, and she had learned to make herself nearly invisible. Eyes downcast, movements efficient and quiet, projecting the humble subservience that allowed slaves to exist unnoticed in the presence of their betters. Most nobles looked through servants as if they were furniture with legs, and this invisibility had become Naia's protection. Her sleeping quarters were shared with a dozen other kitchen slaves in a long, low room behind the main cooking areas. The women ranged in age from barely adolescent to ancient, representing a dozen different homelands and circumstances that had led to bondage. Some had been born into slavery and knew no other life. Others, like Naia, were war captives still adjusting to their fate. In the evenings, when work was finished and they had eaten their simple meal of bread and vegetables, some of the women would talk quietly about their dreams. Most dreamed of freedom that seemed impossibly distant, of returning to families they would likely never see again, of lives that had been interrupted by the brutal mathematics of conquest and commerce. Naia's dreams were different. She dreamed not of returning to her old life, but of somehow creating a new one that honored both where she had come from and where she found herself now. She had accepted that she would likely remain a slave until death, but acceptance did not mean surrender of all hope for dignity and meaning. The Thou's gardens at dawn were a sanctuary of peace. Before the day's activities began in earnest, Khaemwaset had taken to walking these paths in the early morning hours, telling himself it was for contemplation and exercise, though he knew the truth was more complicated. For 3 days since the victory feast, he had found himself hoping to glimpse again the water-bearer, whose eyes had held such unexpected depth. On the 4th morning, his patience was rewarded. Naia appeared at the garden well, her clay vessel balanced gracefully on her shoulder. She wore a small carved lotus pendant at her throat, the only ornament that distinguished her simple white shift from those of countless other palace servants. The lotus symbol spoke of rebirth and purity, and Khaemwaset found himself wondering what significance it held for her. This time, when their eyes met, neither looked away immediately. There was something in that prolonged gaze, a recognition that transcended the vast social distance between general and slave. Khaemwaset approached slowly, aware that his presence could mean trouble for her, if observed by the wrong people. "You serve in the kitchens," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Yes, my lord." Her response was properly submissive, but there was no tremor of fear in her voice. "What is your name?" "Naia, my lord." "You are not Egyptian-born." It was not a question. Her accent carried subtle traces of the southern kingdoms. "I am from Nubia, my lord. Taken in the raids 3 years past." Khaemwaset felt an unexpected stab of something that might have been regret. His own campaigns had created thousands of slaves like this young woman, torn from their homes and families to serve Egypt's expansion. It was the way of conquest, as natural and inevitable as the Nile's flood. But standing before this particular consequence of his victories gave the abstract reality a troubling human face. "Can you read?" The question surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her. Naia hesitated, and in that hesitation he read both truth and caution. Literacy among slaves was not forbidden, but it was unusual and could make one suspect of having ideas above their station. "Some, my lord. I have observed the sacred writings in the palace corridors." Observed. He almost smiled at her careful choice of words. "What do these observations tell you about the stories written on these walls?" For a moment her formal mask slipped, revealing the intelligent curiosity he had sensed at their first meeting. "They tell of pharaohs who built great monuments, of gods who shaped the world, of the eternal struggle between order and chaos. They remind us that even the mightiest rulers return to dust, but that actions echo through generations. The sophistication of her response struck him like a physical blow. This was no simple kitchen slave repeating memorized phrases, but a mind capable of understanding complex philosophical concepts. In the royal court, many nobles would struggle to articulate such insights with equal clarity. "You speak like someone who has had teachers. Life teaches those who pay attention, my lord." They talked for perhaps a quarter hour, their conversation ranging from the palace gardens to the nature of the gods, from the customs of her homeland to her observations of court life. Khaemwaset found himself speaking more freely than he had in years, drawn out by her genuine curiosity and thoughtful responses. When she mentioned her people's belief that souls were reborn like the lotus emerging from muddy water, he felt something shift inside him. Here was someone who understood that external circumstances did not define internal worth, that dignity could survive even the most degrading condition. As the sun rose higher and the palace began to stir with daily activity, both became aware that their conversation had already lasted longer than was safe or proper. Other servants would soon be moving through these areas, and discovery could bring severe punishment for Naia. "I should return to my duties," she said, lifting the water vessel. "Yes, but..." Khaemwaset hesitated, unsure how to express what he was feeling. "I walk these gardens each morning at this hour. I fetch water each morning at this hour, my lord." The exchange was simple, but it carried the weight of mutual understanding. Tomorrow they would meet again, and perhaps the day after that. Neither spoke of the dangers such meetings might bring, or questioned why Egypt's greatest general would seek conversation with a Nubian slave girl. As Naia walked away, her water vessel balanced with unconscious grace, Khaemwaset found himself thinking about lotus flowers emerging from mud, about souls that could not be diminished by circumstance, and about the strange alchemy that could transform a casual encounter into something that felt like destiny. The papyrus arrived hidden within a basket of figs from the palace orchards. Naia discovered it while sorting the fruit for the evening meal, her fingers brushing against the smooth surface tucked beneath the offerings. Her heart quickened as she recognized the careful hieroglyphs, not the formal script of official documents, but the personal hand of someone educated in the classical style. "Meet me in the southern garden when the moon rises. There are things I must tell you that cannot be spoken in daylight." The message was unsigned, but she knew its author. For 2 weeks now, their dawn encounters had become the rhythm around which her entire existence revolved. What had begun as cautious conversation had deepened into something neither of them fully understood, but both felt powerless to resist. Khaemwaset revealed himself to be far different from the iron warrior of legend. Away from the formal constraints of court life, he spoke with surprising gentleness about his childhood as a blacksmith's son who had risen through merit rather than birth. His father had taught him that strength without wisdom was mere brutality, and that true nobility came from character rather than bloodlines. "I was smaller than the other boys until my 15th year, he had confided during one of their meetings. "They called me Little Hammer because my father made tools. I learned early that respect must be earned, not assumed." These revelations had touched something deep within Naia's heart. Here was a man who understood what it meant to be judged by circumstances rather than essence, who had fought his way from obscurity to greatness through determination and principle. Their backgrounds could not have been more different, yet they shared the knowledge of what it meant to be underestimated and dismissed. That evening she slipped through the palace corridors with the practiced stealth of someone who had learned to move unseen. The southern garden was the most secluded of the palace's outdoor spaces, used primarily for growing medicinal herbs and rarely visited after dark. Moonlight filtered through date palms and acacia trees, creating patterns of silver and shadow that seemed to shift with every breeze. Khaemwaset was waiting beside a small fountain, his massive frame somehow seeming less intimidating in the gentle light. Without his ceremonial armor and weapons, dressed simply in a plain kilt and linen shirt, he looked more like a prosperous merchant than Egypt's most feared general. "I was not certain you would come," he said softly, "nor was I until I found myself walking here." They sat on a stone bench beside the fountain, maintaining a careful distance that acknowledged both propriety and the magnetic pull they felt toward each other. The sound of water trickling over carved stones provided cover for their voices, but both spoke in whispers from habit and necessity. "I have been thinking about what you said yesterday," Khaemwaset began, "about your village, your family. I realize that my victories have cost people like you everything they held dear." "The gods write our fates before we are born," Naia replied carefully. "What happened to my family was tragedy, but it brought me here to this moment. Perhaps that too serves some purpose we cannot see. You have remarkable wisdom for someone so young. Pain ages the soul quickly, my lord. When we are alone like this, I wish you would call me by my name." The request was startling in its intimacy. Names held power in Egyptian belief, and for a slave to speak a noble's personal name implied a relationship that transcended formal hierarchy. Yet something in his tone made refusal impossible. "Khaemwaset," she said quietly, tasting the syllables like exotic honey. He told her then about his own loneliness at the heights of power, how victory in battle had brought him wealth and status, but little genuine human connection. Noble women sought him for political advantage, while servants feared him too much for honest conversation. In her he had found someone who spoke to him as simply a man, without calculation or terror. "Sometimes I dream of a different life," he admitted. "A quieter existence where worth is measured by kindness rather than conquest." "And what would you do in this different life?" "Perhaps I would tend gardens, grow things instead of destroying them, build homes for families instead of burning them." He paused, looking at her with an expression that made her heart race. Share that peaceful life with someone who understood both its value and its costs. The implications in his words hung between them like incense smoke, sweet and dangerous. They both understood that they stood at the edge of something that could transform or destroy them both. The social gulf between Egypt's greatest general and a Nubian slave girl was not merely vast, it was absolute, protected by laws and customs that had governed the kingdom for generations. Yet in that moonlit garden, surrounded by the whispers of night-blooming jasmine and the gentle music of flowing water, such barriers seemed as insubstantial as shadows. The great throne room of Pharaoh Amenhotep III had witnessed many extraordinary moments in its storied history, but none quite like this. Khaemwaset knelt before the golden throne, his head bowed in the traditional pose of supplication, while in his hands he held a papyrus scroll that would either make history or end his career in disgrace. The royal marriage scroll bore the formal language required for such momentous requests, each hieroglyph carefully crafted by the palace's most skilled scribes. Yet the words it contained were so unprecedented that several scribes had initially refused to write them, claiming such a document violated the natural order established by the gods themselves. "Rise, my lion," Pharaoh Amenhotep commanded, his voice carrying across the vast chamber. "Present your petition." Around the throne room, the assembled court held its collective breath. Word had spread that General Khaemwaset sought a private audience on a matter of great personal importance, and speculation had run wild through the palace corridors. Some whispered that he planned to request additional territories to govern. Others suggested he might ask for permission to establish his own dynasty in the southern provinces. None had imagined this. "Vain, Devon, Blessed of Ra, I come before you with a request that springs from both heart and careful consideration." Khaemwaset's voice remained steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to propose. "I seek your permission to take as my wife the slave Naia of Nubia, currently serving in the palace kitchens." The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to press against the walls like physical weight. Even the ever-present palace musicians fell quiet, their instruments hanging motionless in suddenly nerveless hands. Princess Ankh-Shanaman, who had been seated in a position of honor near the throne, rose so abruptly that her golden chair scraped against the marble floor. Her face had drained of all color, leaving her makeup stark and mask-like against pallid skin. She had spent months carefully positioning herself as the obvious choice for the great general's bride, hosting intimate dinners and making herself available for private conversations that she had assumed would eventually lead to a marriage proposal. "A slave," she whispered, the word carrying clearly in the absolute stillness. High Priest Amenemheb stepped forward, his elaborate ceremonial robes rustling with indignation. As the kingdom's highest religious authority, he viewed himself as guardian of the divine order that placed pharaohs at the apex of creation and slaves at its foundation. "This is blasphemy," he declared, his voice shaking with outrage. "The general asks to overturn the sacred hierarchy established by the gods themselves. A warrior of noble blood cannot pollute his lineage with slave-born children. Such a union would be an abomination in the sight of Ma." "The woman is Nubian," added Vizier Perhotep, his tone suggesting that this fact alone settled the matter. "A war captive whose people have been enemies of Egypt for generations. How can we trust that such a marriage would not compromise our military secrets or provide intelligence to our enemies?" Pharaoh Amenhotep raised his hand for silence, though his own expression revealed deep shock at his most trusted general's unprecedented request. The ruler had governed Egypt for nearly 3 decades, navigating countless political crises with wisdom and pragmatism, but this situation fell outside all established precedents. "Khaemwaset," the pharaoh said carefully, "you could have your choice of any noble daughter in the kingdom. Princess Ankhesenamun herself has indicated her willingness to consider such an alliance. Why do you seek to bind yourself to a woman of no birth, no dowry, no political advantage?" "Because, Divine One, I have discovered that the heart recognizes qualities that have nothing to do with birth or political calculation." Khaemwaset's response carried the quiet conviction of a man who had wrestled with his decision through many sleepless nights. "This woman possesses wisdom, courage, and nobility of spirit that would honor any household. She understands loyalty, having remained faithful to her own people's memory despite years of bondage. She speaks with intelligence about matters of philosophy and statecraft that would challenge many nobles. She is a slave." Princess Ankhesenamun's composure finally cracked entirely. "A piece of property to be bought and sold, not a person capable of standing as equal to Egypt's greatest general. She is a human soul beloved of the gods." Khaemwaset replied firmly, "Her circumstances do not define her essence any more than mine define me. I rose from humble origins through merit and service. Should the same path not be available to one who demonstrates equal worth?" The argument that followed shook the throne room's foundations. Nobles shouted objections while priests quoted ancient texts about the divinely ordained social order. Some pointed to practical concerns about military security and diplomatic relationships. Others argued that such a precedent would encourage dangerous social upheaval throughout the kingdom. Through it all, Pharaoh Amenhotep remained silent, his weathered face revealing nothing of his internal struggle. He owed Khaemwaset more than any ruler should owe, a single subject: victories that had expanded Egypt's territory and filled its treasury, loyalty that had never wavered through decades of service, wisdom in counsel that had prevented countless disasters. Finally, the pharaoh spoke. "The general's service to Egypt cannot be questioned. His loyalty has been proven in blood across a dozen battlefields. If this is truly his wish, and if the woman herself consents to such an elevation, then let it be done." The poisoned wine goblet gleamed innocuously on Naia's small table, its decorated surface depicting scenes of harvest and abundance. The cup had been a gift from one of the palace's minor nobles, presented as a gesture of welcome to her new status, though Naia had learned to view such unexpected kindnesses with suspicion. 3 days had passed since Pharaoh's announcement, and the palace atmosphere had turned toxic with whispered conversations and meaningful glances. Noble families who had spent generations building their positions through careful marriages and political alliances watched in horror as their established order crumbled before the unprecedented elevation of a slave girl. Naia lifted the goblet to her lips, then hesitated. Something about the wine's scent seemed wrong, too sweet, with an underlying bitterness that reminded her of the oleander plants that grew wild in her homeland. Her mother had taught her to recognize dangerous plants, knowledge that had proven useful during her years of gathering herbs for the palace kitchens. She set the cup down untouched, just as Khaemwaset entered her new court. The rooms were modest by noble standards, but luxurious beyond anything she had ever imagined. painted walls depicting scenes from the afterlife, furniture of carved cedar and ebony, linens soft as flower petals. Yet all this splendor felt like a beautiful prison, separating her from the familiar routines that had given her life structure and purpose. Peace. You look troubled, he observed, settling beside her with the careful attention he now paid to her every mood and expression. Someone wishes me to join the ancestors prematurely, she replied, indicating the goblet. The wine carries the scent of oleander. Khaemwaset's face darkened with fury as he examined the cup. His warrior's instincts, honed by years of expecting treachery from enemies, had apparently failed to anticipate that the greatest threats might come from within the palace itself. From now on you eat and drink nothing that has not been prepared by my own servants and tasted first by others, he commanded, his voice carrying the iron authority of the battlefield. I should have realized that some would resort to murder rather than accept change. The attempt on her life was only the most direct manifestation of the hostility that surrounded them. Noble ladies, who had previously ignored her existence, now watched her every movement with calculating eyes, searching for evidence that she was unfit for her elevated position. Servants who had once been her equals now treated her with a confused mixture of deference and resentment, uncertain how to behave toward someone who had transcended the boundaries they had accepted as. Princess Ankhesenamun had emerged as the most vocal opponent of the union, using her royal status to organize resistance among the court's most conservative elements. She appeared at every public gathering, wearing expressions of barely controlled outrage, making comments loud enough to be overheard about the degradation of ancient bloodlines and the gods' certain displeasure with such violations of natural order. My great-grandmother would rise from her tomb to see a kitchen slave wearing the jewelry of nobility, she declared at one court function, her words carrying clearly across the assembled guests. High Priest Amenemhab had taken a different but equally dangerous approach, questioning whether Naia's foreign origins might indicate divided loyalties that could threaten Egypt's security. He suggested that her elevation might be part of some elaborate Nubian plot to infiltrate the highest levels of Egyptian society. How can we be certain that this woman's affections are genuine rather than calculated? He asked, during a public religious ceremony. Foreign enemies have long sought to corrupt our strength through seduction and betrayal. Even great warriors can be deceived by cunning women trained in the arts of manipulation. The accusations stung not because they threatened her safety, but because they attacked the one thing she valued above all else, the genuine nature of her feelings for Khaemwaset. Their love had grown from mutual recognition of shared values and complementary strengths, not from any calculation or design. To have it characterized as manipulation felt like sacrilege. Yet she understood the political realities that drove such attack. Her marriage to Khaemwaset threatened the established system through which noble families maintained their power and position. If a slave girl could rise to become the wife of Egypt's greatest general, what other assumptions about the permanence of social hierarchy might prove equally fragile? Sometimes I wonder if we are being selfish, she confided to Khaemwaset one evening, as they walked through gardens that now felt more like a battlefield than a sanctuary. Perhaps the cost to the kingdom's stability is too high for the sake of our happiness. The kingdom's stability rests on justice and merit, not on preserving privileges for those who contribute nothing but their bloodlines, he replied firmly. If our union helps Egypt evolve beyond such arbitrary limitations, then we serve a greater purpose than our individual desires. The golden marriage collar lay heavy across Naia's shoulders like a beautiful burden, its intricate metalwork depicting intertwined lotus flowers and falcons, symbols of rebirth and divine protection. Crafted by the kingdom's finest jewelers, it marked her transformation from slave to noble wife, yet its weight served as a constant reminder of how precarious her new position truly was. The wedding ceremony itself had been a study in controlled tension. The great temple of Amun-Ra, normally a place of joyous celebration for royal marriages, buzzed with undercurrents of disapproval and barely contained hostility. Half the assembled nobles wore expressions that suggested they were attending a funeral rather than a wedding, while the other half maintained frozen smiles that fooled no one. Khaemwaset stood beside the altar in his finest ceremonial armor, polished bronze gleaming in the temple's filtered sunlight. The sacred khopesh at his side and the victory laurels on his brow reminded everyone present of his invaluable service to Egypt, a visual argument for why his unusual choice of bride should be respected, if not celebrated. High Priest Heb performed the ceremony with technically correct but noticeably cold precision, each ritual word delivered as if it tasted bitter on his tongue. When the moment came to pronounce them united in the sight of the gods, his pause lasted just long enough to suggest reluctance without actually refusing his duty. By the will of Ra and the blessing of Pharaoh, let this union be recognized in earth and heaven, he intoned, the traditional words carrying none of their usual warmth. Princess Ankhesenamun sat in the front row of noble witnesses, her beauty enhanced by cosmetics that couldn't quite hide the rage burning in her dark eyes. She had arrived wearing black and gold colors, of mourning and royalty combined in a deliberate insult that everyone present understood perfectly. Her presence was both a political necessity and a personal torment. The common people of Thebes had gathered outside the temple in far greater numbers than anyone had expected, and their reaction proved surprisingly mixed. Some clearly disapproved of seeing natural order overturned, muttering prayers for the gods' forgiveness and predicting disasters to follow. But others, even fascinated by the unprecedented love story, perhaps seeing in Naia's elevation a hope that merit might sometimes triumph over birth. If a slave can become a general's wife, perhaps my son might rise above his station too, one woman was heard to whisper, her words carrying both hope and dangerous precedent. Inside the temple, as sacred incense filled the air and ancient prayers echoed off painted walls, Naia felt the weight of history pressing down upon her shoulders alongside the golden collar. She was not merely marrying the man she loved. She was shattering barriers that had stood for centuries, creating ripples that would spread far beyond the boundaries of their personal happiness. The wedding feast that followed proved even more challenging than the ceremony itself. Tables groaned under elaborate displays of food and wine, but conversations died whenever Naia approached groups of guests. Noble ladies examined her with the intensity of scholars studying an exotic specimen, searching for flaws in her deportment or evidence of her unsuitability for elevated status. "She holds her wine cup correctly," one duchess observed with apparent disappointment. "But notice how she favors her left hand, a sure sign of foreign habits," another replied, as if this minor preference revealed deep character defects. Khaemwaset remained close to his new wife throughout the evening, his protective presence both comforting and necessary. Several times he was forced to redirect conversations that veered toward open hostility, his reputation as a warrior serving as an effective deterrent to direct confrontation. The gifts presented to the couple revealed the political landscape with painful clarity. Pharaoh's offering was magnificently generous, a villa outside the city with extensive grounds and full household staff, demonstrating his continued support. But many nobles presented gifts that carried subtle insults. Household slaves from Nubia so the new bride might feel more at home, cooking vessels suitable for one familiar with kitchen work, or jewelry that was technically appropriate but deliberately modest. As the evening progressed and wine loosened tongues, the whispered conversations grew bolder. References to historical disasters that had befallen kingdoms when natural order was disrupted. Pointed discussions of the gods' tendency to punish hubris with dramatic reversals of fortune. Speculation about how long such an unnatural arrangement could possibly endure. Yet through all the hostility and barely veiled threats, moments of genuine connection emerged. A few nobles approached with sincere congratulations, perhaps recognizing something admirable in love that had overcome such overwhelming obstacles. Some younger courtiers seemed intrigued by the precedent being set, as if calculating how it might affect their own romantic possibilities. When the formal ceremonies finally concluded and they retired to their private chambers, Naia collapsed onto a cushioned divan, with exhaustion that was as much emotional as physical. The golden collar felt heavier than ever, its beauty unable to compensate for the isolation it represented. The broken mirror of polished bronze lay scattered across the marble floor like fallen stars, each shard reflecting distorted fragments of the argument that had shattered it, along with Naia's careful composure. She stared at the pieces, seeing her fractured image multiplied into dozens of painful glimpses, a nose here, an eye there, lips twisted with frustration and hurt. 3 months of marriage had worn away the initial euphoria of their union, revealing stresses that neither had fully anticipated. The constant scrutiny, the social isolation, and the weight of representing something larger than themselves had begun to take its toll on both of them, manifesting in ways that surprised and alarmed them both. "You ask me to be someone I have never been," Naia said, her voice tight with exhaustion. "To smile graciously, while noble ladies examine my every gesture for signs of inadequacy. To speak of poetry and philosophy, while they wait for evidence that I am just a clever slave pretending to wisdom." Khaemwaset stood with his back to her, his massive frame rigid with his own frustration. The man who had never shown fear facing enemy armies seemed lost when confronting the complexities of domestic harmony under impossible circumstances. "I ask only that you be yourself," he replied, though they both knew the statement was naive. The woman who had drawn him with her authentic spirit in the palace gardens could not exist unchanged in the goldfish bowl of noble society. "Myself?" Naia's laugh held no humor. "Which self should I be? The kitchen slave, who knew her place and found peace in simple work. The general's wife, who must entertain women who despise her presence. The Nubian captive, who still dreams sometimes of her homeland's song. I am becoming someone I do not recognize, and I fear you are falling in love with a person who no longer exists." The argument had begun over something trivial, her refusal to attend yet another social gathering, where she would be displayed like a curiosity and judged by standards she had never been taught to meet. But it had quickly escalated into deeper fears and resentments that had been building like floodwaters behind a weakening dam. Khaemwaset turned to face her, and she saw her own exhaustion reflected in his eyes. The campaign-hardened warrior who had seemed so confident about overcoming social barriers now looked as lost as she felt. "Perhaps you were right to question whether our happiness justifies the chaos we have created," he said quietly. "Every day brings fresh evidence that our enemies will not accept this marriage, will not allow us peace to build something beautiful together." The admission struck her like a physical blow. If Khaemwaset, her anchor, her defender, her partner in this impossible venture, was beginning to doubt their path, then what hope remained for their survival as a couple? "So you regret choosing me?" The question emerged as barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of all her deepest fears. "Never." His response was immediate and fierce. "But I regret that my choice has brought you such pain. I thought love would be enough to overcome the obstacles we faced. I was arrogant enough to believe that my position and your strength would be sufficient weapons against centuries of established prejudice." That morning had brought fresh evidence of their precarious situation. 3 more noble families had requested transfers from court positions rather than serve under a regime that would elevate slaves to positions of influence. Rumors circulated about provincial governors questioning whether they should continue sending tribute to a pharaoh who allowed such disruptions to divine order. Most painfully, several of her former companions in the kitchen had been reassigned to other duties, their association with her making them suspect in the eyes of administrators who feared the spread of dangerous ideas about social mobility. "I have become toxic," Naia said, sinking onto a cushioned bench beside the scattered mirror fragments. "My presence poisons everything it touches. The servants fear to be near me, the nobles plot against me, and even you." She gestured helplessly at the broken bronze between them. "Even I lose my temper when I should show patience," Khaemwaset finished, moving to kneel beside her. "But not because I doubt you or us. Because I feel helpless watching you suffer for choices I convinced you to make." The admission hung between them like incense smoke, heavy with truth and pain. They had entered this marriage as partners in a grand gesture of defiance against unjust social barriers. But the daily reality of sustaining that defiance was proving more complex and costly than either had imagined. "There are moments," Naia confessed, "when I wonder if I should have been content with our secret meetings in the garden. At least then our love existed in a space untouched by politics and calculation. And there are moments when I wonder if a truly wise man would release you from this burden, would find a way to restore your freedom without destroying your reputation." They sat in silence among the broken mirror pieces, both contemplating futures that seemed to offer only different forms of sacrifice and loss. The secret seal ring bore the image of a cobra coiled around a dagger, its emerald eyes gleaming with malevolent purpose. High Priest Khaemwaset pressed it into the red wax beneath his carefully crafted letter, adding one more piece of correspondence to the growing network of treasonous communication that spread like poison through the highest levels of Egyptian society. Princess Cinnamon received the sealed message in her private chambers, where she had been plotting with increasing desperation since the wedding that had shattered her dreams of power. The marriage she had assumed would elevate her to the position of Egypt's most influential woman had instead created a dangerous precedent that threatened everything she had been taught to value. "The situation grows more intolerable daily," the High Priest's letter read. "The foreign woman's influence over our greatest general increases, while her pregnancy becomes more apparent. Soon she will produce an heir whose mixed blood will pollute the very foundations of Egyptian nobility. We must act before this contamination spreads beyond containment." The pregnancy had been announced only 2 weeks earlier, sending fresh shockwaves through the court. What had been merely an unprecedented marriage now threatened to become a dynasty, with children who would carry both the blood of Egypt's greatest warrior and a Nubian slave. The prospect filled conservative nobles with something approaching panic. Princess Salomon set down the letter and moved to her writing table, where maps of the kingdom and lists of potential allies lay spread like battle plans. Her correspondence network now included minor nobles, provincial governors, military commanders, and even foreign ambassadors who viewed Egypt's internal discord as an opportunity for their own nation's advancement. "My dear Khaemwaset," she wrote in response, her stylus moving across papyrus with swift precision, "your concerns mirror my own. However, direct action against the general himself would be both dangerous and potentially counterproductive. His military reputation makes him nearly untouchable, and martyrdom might only strengthen his legend. We must focus our efforts on the true source of corruption, his foreign wife." The conspiracy had grown far beyond its initial core of disgruntled nobles. Family after family had joined their cause as they witnessed the traditional social order crumbling before the precedent of merit overruling birth. Each new recruit brought additional resources, connections, and legitimacy to their movement. Lord Amenhotep II, governor of the southern provinces, had proven particularly valuable. His territories bordered Nubia, and he had convinced Centralit's military commanders that Naia's elevation represented a security threat that could encourage rebellion among Egypt's Nubian population. "If slaves begin to believe they can rise above their stations through seduction and manipulation," he had written in one of his contributions to their correspondence, "how long before every captured enemy sees palace service as an opportunity for infiltration rather than punishment?" The arguments were carefully constructed to seem patriotic rather than merely self-serving, focusing on threats to Egyptian security and divine order rather than personal ambition. But underneath the noble language lay simpler motives: fear of change, resentment of lost privilege, and wounded pride at seeing established hierarchies overturned. General Horemheb, one of Khaemwaset's own subordinates, had provided perhaps the most valuable intelligence. His loyalty to Egypt, he claimed, compelled him to report his commander's increasing isolation from traditional military advisors and his growing reliance on his wife's counsel on matters of strategy and diplomacy. The general discusses military plans with a foreign woman whose ultimate loyalties remain questionable. Horemheb's report suggested, "Her influence over him has become so complete that some fear she could be relaying sensitive information to Nubian agents still active in our territories." The accusations were carefully crafted lies, but they played upon legitimate concerns about military security that even Pharaoh Amenhotep could not completely dismiss. By framing their opposition in terms of national defense rather than social prejudice, the conspirators had found arguments that resonated with officials who might otherwise support the unusual marriage. Princess Ankhesenamun's own role in the conspiracy gave it royal legitimacy that attracted previously reluctant participants. Her bloodline and proximity to the throne made opposition to the marriage seem not just socially acceptable, but patriotically necessary. Foreign elements had begun to take interest as well. Hittite and Assyrian ambassadors, sensing opportunity in Egypt's internal divisions, had made discreet inquiries about whether certain factions might benefit from external support. The prospect of Egypt's greatest general being neutralized by domestic scandal rather than military defeat had obvious appeal to traditional enemies. The conspiracy's scope had grown beyond anything its founders had initially imagined. What had begun as court intrigue had evolved into something approaching a shadow government, complete with its own communication networks, funding sources, and strategic objectives. The secret seal ring that authenticated their correspondence had become a symbol of resistance to change that threatened to tear Egyptian society apart. As night fell over the palace, dozens of similar letters moved through hidden channels, carrying plans that would soon transform private resentment into public action against the marriage that had dared to challenge the eternal order of the gods. The false oracle bones lay arranged on the sacred altar like evidence of divine judgment, their surfaces carved with ominous symbols that supposedly revealed the gods' displeasure with recent events in the royal court. High Priest Amenhotep stood before the assembled nobles, his ceremonial robes lending weight to accusations that would have seemed incredible coming from any lesser authority. "The bones of prophecy have spoken," he announced, his voice carrying the resonant authority of one who claimed to interpret divine will. "Through sacred divination, the gods have revealed a great corruption in our midst, foreign sorcery that threatens to poison the very heart of Egypt." The morning's dramatic revelation had begun with reports from palace guards who claimed to have discovered suspicious items hidden in Khaemwaset and Naia's private quarters. Strange powders that might be poisons, amulets bearing foreign symbols, most damning of all, carved bones that appeared to be used for divination practices forbidden within Egypt's borders. Naia stood in the center of the great hall, her pregnancy now visible beneath her finest robes, facing accusations that could result in exile or death. The evidence arrayed against her seemed overwhelming to those predisposed to believe in her guilt, though she recognized immediately that every item had been carefully planted to support predetermined conclusions. "The accused stands before you carrying a child," High Priest Amenhotep continued, his voice rising with theatrical outrage. "But what manner of child grows within a womb touched by foreign magic? What corruption might she pass to future generations if her evil influence is allowed to spread unchecked?" Pharaoh Amenhotep sat upon his golden throne with an expression of profound wariness, as if the weight of this crisis had aged him years in mere weeks. The ruler who had governed Egypt through decades of prosperity and expansion now faced a situation that threatened to tear his kingdom apart, regardless of how he chose to respond. "General Khaemwaset," the pharaoh said heavily, "what answer do you make to these grave accusations against your wife?" Khaemwaset stepped forward, his warriors bearing unchanged despite the magnitude of the crisis confronting him. His hand rested instinctively on the hilt of his ceremonial sword, though no weapon could cut through the web of lies and manufactured evidence that surrounded them. "Divine Pharaoh, these accusations are fabrications designed to destroy what jealous enemies cannot accept through honest means. My wife practices no foreign magic, follows no forbidden rituals, serves no interests but those of Egypt and our family." "Yet the evidence speaks clearly," Princess Ankhesenamun interjected, her voice carrying the cold satisfaction of someone whose carefully laid plans were finally bearing fruit. "Items of power were found hidden in your very chambers. Oracle bones carved with symbols that match those used by Nubian sorcerers to curse their enemies. How do you explain such discoveries?" "I explain them as planted evidence, Naia spoke for the first time, her voice carrying clearly despite the tremor that betrayed her fear. Any person with access to our quarters could have hidden such items, knowing they would eventually be discovered at a moment convenient to those who oppose our marriage. A murmur ran through the assembled crowd, some shocked at a slave girl's boldness in speaking unbidden before Pharaoh, others perhaps recognizing the logic of her defense. The political divisions that had been brewing for months now stood revealed in harsh daylight, with every noble forced to choose sides in a conflict that would reshape Egyptian society. Lord Pehotep, the elderly vizier, whose family had served pharaohs for generations, stepped forward with obvious reluctance. The accusations are grave enough to demand formal investigation, but we must also consider the character and service of those accused. General Khaemwaset's loyalty to Egypt has never been questioned. His victories have brought glory and wealth to our kingdom, which makes his corruption all the more dangerous. High Priest Amenemheb replied swiftly. A man of his position and influence, if compromised by foreign sorcery, could damage Egypt far more severely than any external enemy. The gods themselves warn us through these sacred bones that his judgment has been clouded by unnatural influence. The debate that followed revealed the true depth of the conspiracy against them. Witness after witness came forward with carefully rehearsed testimony about strange sounds from their quarters, unusual behavior patterns, suspicious meetings with individuals who might have been foreign agents. Each accusation was impossible to disprove completely, designed to create an atmosphere of doubt and suspicion rather than present definitive proof of wrongdoing. Yet through all the orchestrated testimony, inconsistencies began to emerge. Dates that didn't align properly, descriptions of events that contradicted each other in subtle but significant ways, details that revealed more preparation than spontaneous observation. Naia watched the proceedings with growing understanding of how completely she had been outmaneuvered. Her enemies had spent months constructing this trap, anticipating every possible defense and preparing responses that would discredit any protest of innocence. The oracle bones were merely the culmination of a campaign that had been building since the day her marriage was announced. The sacred scales of Ma'at gleamed in the temple's filtered sunlight, their golden surfaces polished to mirror brightness and balanced with the precise engineering that symbolized divine justice. The ancient artifact had witnessed countless trials throughout Egypt's long history, but none quite like this, where the accused was a pregnant woman whose guilt or innocence would determine not just her fate, but the future of the kingdom's social order. High Priest Amenemheb approached the scales with ceremonial solemnity, his movements choreographed by centuries of religious tradition. In one palm he placed a white feather representing truth and divine judgment. In the other he would place symbolic representations of Naia's alleged crimes, allowing the goddess Ma'at herself to weigh the evidence and render final verdict. Before the eyes of gods and mortals, he intoned, "Let justice be served through trial by sacred ordeal. If the accused speaks truth, the goddess will protect her. If she lies, divine judgment will be swift and final." The temple had filled beyond capacity with spectators drawn by the unprecedented nature of the proceeding. Nobles, priests, common citizens and foreign ambassadors crowded every available space, their faces reflecting the excitement and dread that accompanied moments when history pivots on a single event. Naia stood before the altar, wearing simple white robes that emphasized both her pregnancy and her vulnerability. Her hands rested protectively over her swelling belly, where her child, innocent of all accusations, would share whatever fate the gods decreed for its mother. Khaemwaset had been forced to watch from a designated area reserved for interested parties, his warriors training useless against the religious protocols that governed this ancient form of justice. His hands clenched and unclenched repeatedly as he struggled with the helplessness of being unable to protect the woman he loved through strength of arms. The first ordeal required Naia to walk barefoot across a path of burning coals while carrying a sacred Ankh symbol. The brazier had been prepared at dawn, the coals glowing white-hot and radiating waves of heat that distorted the air above them. According to tradition, the innocent would pass through unharmed while the guilty would suffer burns that revealed divine judgment. "I place my trust in Ma'at, goddess of truth and justice," Naia declared, her voice steady despite the obvious danger she faced. Let her protection shield the innocent and expose the guilty wherever they may stand. The pointed reference to guilt existing elsewhere in the temple was not lost on the assembled crowd, several of whom shifted uncomfortably as they considered the implications of her words. She stepped onto the first coal, her face tightening with pain but showing no other sign of distress. Step by careful step, she made her way across the glowing path, her pregnancy making balance more difficult, but her determination unwavering. The crowd watched in tense silence, broken only by the hiss and crackle of the coals beneath her feet. When she reached the far side and stepped onto cool stone, gasps echoed through the temple. Her feet showed redness from the heat, but no serious burns, no blistering that would indicate divine condemnation. She had passed the first trial in a manner that suggested either innocence or remarkable luck. High Priest Amenemheb's expression revealed frustration that he quickly masked with renewed ceremonial dignity. The first test has been completed, but the goddess requires fuller proof before rendering final judgment. Let the accused now face the sacred waters. The second ordeal involved immersion in the temple's holy pool, where the guilty would supposedly sink like stones, while the innocent would float with divine assistance. The pool was deeper than a person's height, and Naia's pregnancy would make swimming more difficult, a factor that her enemies had undoubtedly considered when designing this particular trial. She approached the water's edge with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout the proceedings, pausing only to remove her outer robe so that its weight would not drag her down. The simple shift that remained emphasized the curve of her belly and the fundamental cruelty of subjecting an expectant mother to such dangerous tests. "Great Mat," she prayed aloud, "judge not only my actions but the actions of all who stand in this sacred place. Let truth emerge from these waters, whatever form it may take." She entered the pool slowly, the sacred water rising around her body until it reached her chest. Then, following the ritual requirements, she released her hold on the pool's edge and allowed herself to float freely in the deeper water. What happened next would be debated for generations. Some claimed to see a golden glow surrounding her body in the water. Others swore that her pregnancy gave her natural buoyancy that explained her ability to remain afloat. But all agreed on the most important fact: she did not sink, did not require rescue, did not display any of the signs that tradition associated with divine condemnation. The glowing Ankh amulet around Naia's neck began to pulse with soft golden light as she emerged from the sacred pool, water streaming from her hair and robes, while the ancient symbol of life seemed to burn within a fire. The assembled crowd drew back in amazement and fear, for such manifestations were the stuff of legends, not everyday experience in even the most sacred temples. High Priest Amenemheb stared at the glowing amulet with undisguised alarm, his carefully orchestrated trial spinning beyond his control as divine forces seemed to intervene in ways he had never anticipated. The light emanating from the Ankh grew stronger with each passing moment, casting ethereal shadows on the temple walls and creating an atmosphere of supernatural presence that left everyone speechless. "Behold the judgment of the gods," Naia declared, her voice carrying with new authority as she stood dripping in the temple's sacred space. "Truth reveals itself to those with eyes to see, while deception shrinks from divine light." The crowd's reaction was immediate and dramatic. Many fell to their knees in recognition of what appeared to be direct divine intervention, while others crossed themselves and whispered prayers to various deities for protection from whatever forces they were witnessing. Even the most skeptical observers found themselves struggling to explain the supernatural phenomenon occurring before their eyes. Pharaoh Amenhotep leaned forward on his throne, his weathered face reflecting both wonder and political calculation as he processed the implications of what was unfolding. A divine sign in favor of Naia would not only vindicate her personally, but also validate the unprecedented social changes her marriage represented. Princess Ankhesenamun stood frozen with horror as she watched months of careful planning dissolve in the face of apparent miraculous intervention. The glowing Ankh seemed to pulse in rhythm with some celestial heartbeat, growing brighter each time the light surged through the ancient gold. "Sorcery," she whispered, then louder, This is foreign magic designed to deceive us all. No true Egyptian amulet would behave in such a manner, but her protest rang hollow against the evidence before their eyes. The Ankh bore traditional Egyptian craftsmanship and hieroglyphic inscriptions that proclaimed devotion to Ma'at and the eternal principles of truth and justice. More importantly, the amulet had been provided by the temple itself as part of the trial ritual, not brought by Naia or her supporters. An elderly priest who served as keeper of temple artifacts stepped forward with trembling hands, his face pale with awe and recognition. The amulet, he stammered, it belonged to Queen Nefertiti herself, blessed by the gods during the reign of Akhenaten. It has remained dark and lifeless in our treasury for generations. The revelation sent fresh shockwaves through the assembled crowd. If the amulet of Egypt's most revered queen had awakened to defend a Nubian slave girl, what message were the gods sending about the nature of true nobility and divine favor? Naia stood at the center of this supernatural drama, her pregnancy making her appear both vulnerable and blessed, like a divine vessel chosen to demonstrate truths that mere mortals had forgotten. The golden light from the Ankh illuminated her face with an otherworldly radiance that transformed her from accused criminal to prophetic figure. I am guilty of no crime but loving across the boundaries that mortals have created, she declared, her words carrying clearly through the vast temple space. The gods recognize no barriers between hearts that seek truth and justice. They judge not by blood or birth, but by the content of the soul. High Priest Amenhotep made one desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. Even if divine forces intervene on behalf of the accused, we must still consider the broader implications for our kingdom's stability. Unusual signs do not necessarily overturn the natural order established by centuries of wisdom. But his words carried no weight against the continuing miracle occurring before their eyes. The Ankh's glow seemed to respond to his protest by growing even brighter, while whispers ran through the crowd about the priest's apparent resistance to divine will. General Horemheb, who had been among the conspirators providing false testimony, now fell to his knees before the glowing figure of Naia, his face twisted with guilt and fear. "Forgive me," he pleaded. "I spoke falsely out of jealousy and political calculation. The gods punish those who pervert justice for personal gain." His public confession opened floodgates as other witnesses began recanting their prepared testimony, admitting to lies and fabrications they had been encouraged to present. The carefully constructed case against Naia collapsed like a house built on sand as divine intervention exposed the human corruption underlying the accusations. The temple's atmosphere had transformed from one of judgment to one of revelation, as if the gods themselves had descended to set the record straight about innocence and guilt, truth and deception, divine favor and human prejudice. The stolen royal correspondence lay spread across Khaemwaset's private study like battle plans for a war fought with words instead of swords. His most trusted agents had spent weeks infiltrating the conspiracy against his family, and the papyrus scrolls they had recovered revealed a network of treason that reached into the highest levels of Egyptian society. Captain Sineb, his most loyal intelligence officer, stood beside the table with grim satisfaction as he pointed to the most damning evidence. "The letters are all authenticated with identical seal impressions, my lord. Each document bears the mark of that serpent and dagger symbol, creating an unbreakable chain of evidence connecting every participant in this conspiracy." Khaemwaset studied the correspondence with the methodical attention he brought to enemy battle plans. The stolen letters revealed not just personal animosity toward his marriage, but active treachery against the pharaoh himself. Several provincial governors had discussed reducing tribute payments if the foreign corruption was allowed to continue. Military commanders had debated whether certain orders should be followed if they came from a general whose judgment was compromised by alien influence. Most shocking of all were the communications with foreign agents. Princess Ankhesenamun had been in direct contact with Hittite ambassadors, discussing terms under which Egypt's traditional enemies might provide support for a regime change that would restore proper order to the kingdom. "This correspondence with the Hittites," Khaemwaset said, his voice deadly quiet, "constitutes open treason against Egypt's interests." She has offered to provide intelligence about our southern defenses in exchange for gold to fund her conspiracy. And here Captain Seneb indicated another set of documents. We have evidence that High Priest Amenemheb has been coordinating with Assyrian merchants to funnel money into Egypt for the purpose of bribing government officials. The foreign powers see our internal discord as an opportunity to weaken us from within. The investigation had begun during Naia's trial, when Khaemwaset realized that her enemy's knowledge of palace security and daily routines suggested insider information that went beyond casual observation. His network of loyal soldiers and palace servants had worked systematically to trace the flow of information and resources that had made the conspiracy possible. What they discovered was a shadow organization that had been operating for months with the efficiency of a military campaign. Safe houses where conspirators met to plan their strategy. Hidden caches of gold provided by foreign sources. Detailed intelligence reports on the movements and habits of potential targets. The scope is breathtaking, Khaemwaset admitted as he reviewed lists of participants. Nearly a third of the court's noble families have been involved to some degree, along with provincial administrators, military officers, and even some priests from temples outside Thebes. The correspondence revealed the conspiracy's ultimate goals, which went far beyond simply destroying his marriage to Naia. They planned to use the controversy as justification for demanding Pharaoh Amenhotep's abdication in favor of a more traditional ruler who would reverse the social changes the marriage represented. Princess Ankhesenemon's letters outlined a vision of Egypt returned to strict hierarchical control, where noble bloodlines would be protected from contamination by common blood, and where foreign influences would be purged from positions of power. Her correspondence with the Hittites suggested she had promised them favorable trade agreements and territorial concessions in exchange for their support. She has sold Egypt's interests to foreign enemies in service of her personal ambition, Khaemwaset observed. His warrior's sense of honor, revolted by such betrayal. This goes beyond mere prejudice against my wife. This is active collaboration with Egypt's enemies. Among the most valuable intelligence they had gathered were detailed records of the conspiracy's financing. Foreign gold had flowed through elaborate networks designed to disguise its origins, funding everything from bribes to palace guards to payments for false witnesses who had testified against Naia. The evidence also revealed how the planted evidence in their quarters had been coordinated. Specific individuals had been paid to gain access to their private rooms and hide the fabricated items that were later discovered during the investigation. The oracle bones, the suspicious powders, the foreign amulets, all had been purchased from merchants who specialized in providing props for political theater. What disturbs me most, Captain Seneb observed, is how close they came to succeeding. If the divine intervention during your wife's trial had not exposed their deceptions, this correspondence suggests they were prepared to move immediately toward open rebellion. Khaemwaset nodded grimly as he organized the documents that would serve as evidence in the trials to come. The stolen correspondence provided not just proof of individual guilt, but a complete map of the treasonous network that had threatened to tear Egypt apart from within. Prepare copies of all these documents for presentation to Pharaoh, he commanded. The golden seal pressed into the wax would make these changes as permanent as any law could be, but their true durability would depend on whether they served Egypt's interests better than the systems they replaced. The coming years would test whether love could indeed prove stronger than tradition, and whether merit could triumph over prejudice in the practical governance of a great kingdom. The golden baby cradle gleamed in the morning sunlight that streamed through the palace windows, its intricate carvings depicting scenes of protection and divine blessing that would guard the infant prince throughout his life. Crafted by Egypt's finest artisans, the cradle represented not just luxury, but hope for a future where the child's mixed heritage would be seen as strength rather than scandal. Prince Khaemwaset slept peacefully within the beautiful vessel, his tiny features reflecting both his father's strong jaw and his mother's delicate bone structure. At 3 months old, he had already become a symbol throughout Egypt of the new possibilities that emerged when love transcended traditional boundaries. Naia sat beside the cradle in the quiet moments before dawn, nursing her son, while while reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this peaceful sanctuary. The woman who had once fetched water as a kitchen slave now helped govern Egypt's domestic policies, her insights valued by pharaoh and council alike. "He has your eyes," Khaemwaset observed, as he joined them in the nursery, his massive warrior's frame seeming almost comically oversized in the delicate chamber designed for their child's comfort and safety. "And your stubborn chin," Naia replied with gentle humor. "I suspect he will prove as determined to follow his own path as his parents were." The months following the conspiracy's collapse had brought changes neither of them had dared imagine. Naia's schools for common children had opened in 5 cities, with enrollment far exceeding expectations as families recognized opportunities previously denied to them. Her literacy programs for palace servants had become so successful that other noble households were requesting similar instruction for their own staff. Khaemwaset had been elevated to the newly created position of strategic advisor to the pharaoh, a role that utilized his military expertise while expanding his influence over diplomatic and domestic affairs. His marriage to a Nubian princess had indeed strengthened Egypt's relationships with the southern kingdoms, exactly as the ancient records had suggested it would. "The delegation from Kush arrives next week," he mentioned, settling into a chair that had been built to accommodate his unusual height. "They're eager to meet their lost princess and discuss new trade agreements that could benefit both kingdoms." "It still feels strange to think of myself as royalty," Naia admitted. "For so long I defined myself by my circumstances rather than my heritage. Now I must learn to see myself as others see me, not just as your wife or our son's mother, but as a bridge between 2 great civilizations." The political landscape had stabilized remarkably quickly once the conspiracy was eliminated and the new laws took effect. Noble families who had initially opposed the changes found themselves adapting to systems that rewarded competence over birthright. Some even discovered that their own children benefited from educational opportunities that had been expanded rather than restricted. Princess Ankhesenamon's exile had removed the most vocal source of opposition, while High Priest Amenemheb's execution had sent a clear message about the consequences of treason. The remaining conservative voices had been forced to work within the new legal framework rather than plotting its destruction. Foreign observers had watched Egypt's transformation with fascination and some concern. Neighboring kingdoms wondered whether similar social changes might sweep through their own territories, carried by trade relationships and diplomatic exchanges. Some had begun quietly implementing their own educational reforms to avoid being left behind. In the palace gardens where they had first fallen in love, Naia and Khaemwaset now walked with their son, showing him the flowers and trees that had witnessed their courtship. The same fountain where they had shared their first intimate conversation now reflected the face of the child whose existence validated their faith in love's power to overcome obstacles. "What do you think he will face as he grows?" Naia wondered, watching their son's fascination with a butterfly that had landed on his blanket. "Challenges we cannot imagine, opportunities we helped create, and choices that will shape Egypt's future in ways we may never know," Khaemwaset replied thoughtfully. "But he will face them with advantages we never had. The knowledge that his heritage includes both warrior strength and royal wisdom, that his parents proved love could triumph over prejudice, and that his kingdom values character over birth." As the sun climbed higher in the sky and the palace began stirring with daily activities, they lingered in the garden that had become sacred to them. Their son gurgled contentedly in his golden cradle, unaware that his very existence represented a victory for justice, love, and the possibility of change in even the most traditional societies. The story that had begun with a giant warrior choosing a slave girl as his bride had evolved into something far greater, a transformation of an entire kingdom's understanding of what made people worthy of respect, love, and opportunity. Their legacy would live not just in their son, but in the countless lives that would be improved by the social changes their courage had made possible.